afternoon, everybody. My name is Eleni Kiza, and I'll be chairing this session. So welcome to one of our first keynotes of the day. On behalf of the EARLI Association and the EARLI Organizing Committee, I would like to welcome Dr. Bart Rienties, one of our first keynotes for the EARLI conference. So Dr. Rienties is Professor of Learning Analytics at the Institute of Education and Technology at the Open University in the UK. He's Program Director of the Learning Analytics within the Institute of Education and Technology and Head of Data Wranglers, whereby he leads a group of learning analytics academics who conduct evidence-based research and engage in sense-making of big data at the Open University. His primary research interests are focused on learning analytics, computer-supported collaborative learning, and the role of motivation in learning. Furthermore, Bart is interested in broader internationalization aspects of higher education. So let me conclude this short introduction with a fun fact, but for a very worthwhile cause. As a passionate cyclist, Professor Rienties recently became world champion in team time trials at the World Transplant Games in Malaga. So don't forget to think about whether you want to become a donor or not, as this could be a life-saving opportunity. So thank you for also participating in this and bringing it up. So as you see, Dr. Rienties' talk has a very provocative title, which will challenge us all to think more intensely about our roles as researchers in education. I look forward to hearing Dr. Rienties about this, so the stage is yours.
Right. Oh, this is very loud. Thank you for being here. It's a rainy day, and I know there are some amazing other keynotes, and I'm really actually honored to be here. I remember 2006, I was in Tartu, in that direction, 100 kilometers from here. And this was the first time that I went to EARLI, the EARLI JIR conference. And I was like, wow, this is an amazing network of people. And who would have thought that now I'm actually standing here in front of you. And I'm going to be really provocative today, because we can ask a fundamental question. Do we still need people like us doing educational research with the prevalence of big data? As you can see, there is a Twitter wall. So if you have comments or questions, please just post them either using the EARLI 2017 hashtag or my name. And there are some amazing assistants walking around. So if you have a question, if I talk too fast or too slow, just raise your hand. I'm very happy to have an open conversation. So let's get the show on the road. First of all, this research would not have been possible without these amazing people. These amazing people at the Open University and outside the university do incredible research. And I only have 45 minutes to show some of their amazing work they're doing. But please Google them, try and see what the amazing research that they're doing today. So the first question is, what is learning analytics? If you could describe it in one word, what is learning analytics? Just one word. Numbers. Feedback on learning, that is technically 3 words, but you're allowed to say that. What else? Data. Technical, yes, what more? Sorry? Evaluation, yes. Is it scary, big data? Yeah? Okay. So in 2012, there was this cloud of what learning analytics was, and you mentioned data, you mentioned students. Did anyone think about machines? Yeah? Okay, cool. So what is quite interesting is that EARLI is also continuously changing, because in the book of abstracts in EARLI, the term learning analytics is mentioned 142 times, which is amazing, right? But if you at the same time look at, if you just do a quick frequency analysis, the #1 word in the EARLI book of abstracts is students, followed by education and teachers. And for some reason, Germany is in the... That must be a typo or something, like a scam. But learning analytics, the term, is only mentioned at 398. So I think we have a little bit of work still to be done at the EARLI conference. So who has seen this definition before? Who has not seen this definition before? Okay, most of you. So this was the first time that learning analytics was mentioned, and it's about the measurement, collection, analysis, and reporting of data about learners and their context for the purposes of understanding and optimizing learning and the environments in which they occur. This was the first time that learning analytics was defined by a group of researchers at the LAC 2011 conference. And if you look at this definition, this is what we do. Right? We as educational researchers, that is more or less what we do. And I personally don't really like this definition. So one of my amazing colleagues in our team, Rebecca Ferguson, complemented this definition by adding the word social to it. So she basically argues, together with Simon Buckingham-Shum, that we should also acknowledge how learners build knowledge together in their social and cultural context. I'm pretty sure that the amazing work we do at the Open University, if we would copy-paste that in your institution, will it work? If we copy-paste our amazing learning analytics engines to your local context, do you think that it will work? No, it wouldn't. So what I'm hopefully going to do to you today is to show you a little bit what learning analytics can do for you as an individual researcher, but also for you as an individual teacher. And there's the holy grail of learning analytics. And the holy grail of learning analytics looks like this. Who has seen the holy grail of learning analytics? Okay, the vast majority has not yet seen the holy grail of learning analytics. So let me talk you through this a little bit. We have, of course, our amazing students. And our amazing students do all kinds of things on their tablets, on their phone, on their computers. And they're writing and they're participating not only in class, but primarily also outside of class. And we, as educational data miners or learning analytics people, can mine that data, and we can collect that data in a learning management system or a virtual learning environment. I quickly skipped over data privacy. I do this on purpose, because otherwise it becomes a really difficult keynote. But secondly, I think there is already a really amazing research and practice done at the Open University. If you Google Sharon Slade, she's a world-leading academic. Basically, how can you implement learning analytics in your local school? How can you implement learning analytics in your local organization in an ethical manner? And we are the first university in the world that has an ethics policy for learning analytics. So I'm not going to skip over that subject, but it's not for this keynote. So Google Sharon Slade. So imagine that we then mine all that data and we put this into an amazing visualizations where we can see some students are doing really well and some students are not doing so well. And then we have this amazing teacher, which of course is a man, unfortunately. And I don't know why it's always a man. And that teacher might actually act upon that data or might actually reflect on maybe I should change the way how I design my courses. So I want to give you 1 minute to talk to your neighbor and discuss what is wrong with this picture. And then afterwards, after that 1 minute, I will ask some of you to just raise your hand, and then our amazing assistants will say what is wrong with this picture. 1 minute, go ahead. Okay, thank you. Thank you. Okay, so who wants to say what is wrong? And then just wait for the mic. Who wants to say what's wrong with this picture? Yeah, there's the one here in front. Inge?
Hi, I'm a bit surprised there's no relation between the teacher and the student. I think that's the most obvious one.
Yep.
Not our few things, but let's not get it.
Yeah. What else is missing except the link between the teacher and there's a gentleman over there all the way in the back? Thank you. Or maybe you can just shout. Yes, very good, very good. I hope you heard that. The arrows basically point in one particular direction, but everything could be open for change. And what is quite interesting, if I'm really honest, most of the learning analytics applications that I see are like this, where we primarily put a teacher at the center of everything, but I haven't seen an application where the students are at the center of learning analytics. And if you have come to see that, please post them on the Twitter wall. So what I hope to show you today is that actually we should start to empower our teachers to help students to close that loop and actually involve students in the learning analytics processes. So Professor Paul Keesner gave an amazing keynote a year ago, and he basically criticized learning analytics researchers that in a way they're not doing a really good job. And the metaphor that I use, and I quite like that metaphor, is that of a drunk. A drunk comes out of a bar and loses his car keys. And then he's walking around, and eventually on the pavement, he's looking around with his mobile phone, where could my car keys be? And the policeman stops him and is like, what are you doing? And then the drunk says, well, I'm looking for my car keys. But why are you looking at the light? Why are you only searching in the light? And I think his argument is that many learning analytics researchers are only looking at data that is easily observable, but actually many things in learning are not easily observable. And now it will become very provocative, and you can shoot me afterwards. I think the same applies to us as educational researchers. So the metaphor that I would like to take is the notion of an eclipse. So many of us, including me, are only focusing on a very small thing in education, and then we're using a glass to look at a very small element. But at the same time, we completely ignore what is happening around us. It's really interesting when you could see the movies of the eclipse. You see all these people looking up the sky, but no one is actually looking at each other. So the metaphor that I'm taking, it says this eclipse light is safe for direct viewing in the sunlight. I basically say, this is a joke a little bit, this is safe for indirect educational viewing. This is what we're doing. When I am observing international students, what do? I send them a survey, a psychometric survey, ideally, or I might interview one or two international students, but is that really giving us an insight of their experiences? Maybe learning analytics can give you much more insight. So I'm being very provocative here, and then feel free to raise your hand and say, okay, this is total bollocks, you totally get it wrong. But what I will do today is show that I think there is an amazing light coming to all of us that helps us to really understand what learning is actually about. And there are, I think, 6 big trends that are occurring. One is there's an increased availability of what I call learner data. So increasingly, our students are continuously leaving behind them many traces of what they are doing, but most importantly also what they are not doing. Secondly, and I don't know whether this is applicable to your context, but at least in the UK, increasingly organizations are linking all that learning data together. So, for example, the UK government is linking how well students are doing in primary schools, how well they are then doing in secondary schools, how well they're doing at university, and how well they're then doing in terms of getting a job. So increasingly all this learner data, so data about the actual learner, is being linked in terms of big data. And this helps the government and other organizations determine which schools are doing really well, which teachers are doing really well. So increasingly this is a phenomenon that doesn't go away. A third thing, which I think everyone is hopefully embracing, is technology. So with the increasing ubiquitous nature of technology, increasingly the first 2 trends will be reciprocated. The fourth trend is, I think, the boundaries between formal and informal learning are disappearing. Yes, our students still go to class from 9 to 2, or our children still go to class from 9 to 3, but a large amount of learning actually occurs outside the classroom, online, and technically we could start to mine all that data, what our students are doing. So in a way, what I'm trying to encourage you is to remove your eclipse glasses, I'm being provocative here, to see what else is happening outside the classroom. And a fifth trend is basically a threatening trend to us as early researchers. So with the increased availability of all this data, an increasing number of companies, and they call them educational data miners, computer scientists who don't know anything, sorry if I offend you, about learning, but they just see a tremendous gold mine of data. And big companies see this as an amazing opportunity to really understand what's happening, and increasingly the power of these educational data miners is influencing government policy. I don't know about your particular context, what you're working in, but increasingly we're being asked, what is the value added of our teaching and learning? And increasingly this is measured by these things like learning analytics. And then last but not least, I don't know what happened here. Sorry about this. It's probably because I stood there and then the buttons didn't work. And the last thing is that our students are changing. Our students are expecting a personalized service. Our students are expecting flexibility. Our students are not expecting, if I go to a university, that I start on the 1st September and then have to wait for 3 years to follow a course which I actually don't really want. I want to follow a course that fits my needs and my interest. And learning analytics allows you to provide this personalized service, in theory. And that's why I'm hoping to show you that there is an amazing power. And these 6 trends, and I really admire the work of Paul Kirchner, but these 6 trends, basically what I'm trying to say is, yes, there is a lot of darkness still in terms of that finding the golden key, but at the same time I think increasingly there will be more light around us to find the magical key of learning. So what I would like to do today, and it's interesting in a way that we're here and you're very quiet, so if you disagree, feel free to challenge me. I would first like to see, okay, how can learning analytics empower the third most important thing at EARLI, namely teachers? And then I want to focus on what is the most important thing, namely how can learning analytics empower our students? And then finally, I would invite you to join us, to join forces. So I think many of you realize that big data is very messy. Data looks nice if you put it onto a PowerPoint slide, but actually processing all that big data is really complex. I mean, the bottom left graph, I mean, what does that actually tell you? It's a lot of lines, but what does it actually say to you? So I think one way to solve the messiness of data is to better understand what are our teachers actually thinking in terms of design, and what are our students actually doing. So the holy solution between, I think, Paul and my worldview, in a way, is by using principles of learning design. So learning design is described as a methodology for enabling teachers to make more informed decisions on how they go about designing learning activities and interventions which are pedagogically informed and make effective use of appropriate resources. So basically what we're trying to do is, by using learning design, we're trying to do a brain scan of teachers, trying to understand, okay, why are they designing particular activities in week 1 or in week 7? And if we can see that teachers intend the students to go in one direction, but the students go in a completely different direction, hey, that is interesting, because then we can start to unpack why are all students moving in one direction while the teachers thought that you would go in a different direction. So what we do at the Open University is we try to do that brain scan of teachers by putting teachers into 7 different learning activities. So these teachers, when they work on designing courses at the Open University, they basically have 7 different menu options of ingredients that they can basically use. So on the left-hand side for you, these are the more traditional learning activities like reading and watching. So just uploading a bit of text. On the right-hand side, more assessment, but the middle bit is more about the kind of socio-constructivist or inquiry-based points. So imagine that we then look at what a teacher actually does. So here, and I apologize for the small print, imagine that in this course, which is a computing-based course, in week 1, a teacher assigns 10 hours of assimilative activities like reading a couple of articles or reading a particular piece of text, and 1.5 hours on finding some information about the basic principles of Bayesian modeling, for example. The nice thing is that we can then see at the end of the week, the student is expected to work on average 13.3 hours. At the same time, what this learning analytics data allows you to do is then to see, okay, how does the kind of work activities, how does that develop over time? So this particular teacher has an amazing assignment in week 5 where students have to do some kind of programming activity together. But that programming activity is very intensive. It's nearly 20 hours. So in week 5, as you can see on the right, there is a 35 hours, sorry, I do apologize, a 35 hours workload to solve that one particular programming task. And he thought it would be a good idea then to give them the week beforehand free to work on that. But is it actually a good idea? Well, we can start by linking that data together, we can see, is it actually good that students are doing this or not? So by linking various data sets together, we can start to think about, okay, what is the best pedagogical design for which types of learners? So what you can then start to do is think about with big data is let's marry various different sources of data together. So for example, how did teachers design courses? What did students then do in the virtual learning environment? Were students happy with the virtual learning environment? And did it actually lead to good performance, in this case, passing the module? And this is a big data study with 111,000 students, so it's big data. So this is the Open University. Oh, it's nice, it's quiet. What does the Open University look like? If you see, this is this is a box plot of 151 courses at the Open University. What's the Open University like? Who would like to take a gamble? Sorry? A clearinghouse, in what way? Yes. There is one module, I'm not going to shame that module, but let's call it module 53, where 90% of the design of activities is about just stuff. Great, that could be amazing stuff written by Brian Cox, but it's just stuff, where students basically have to passively work through, or maybe actively, depending on your theoretical approach. What else do you see from this visualization? Yes, I see that David Bout is in the house. Maybe he thinks that 57% of assessment, is it 57? Sorry, that's incorrect. It's nearly 80% of assessment. Could be amazing. He nods no. But apparently some teachers in their right mind thought that actually would be a really good idea. And what you see quite interesting in the middle is that very few teachers actually design more socio-constructivist approach. There are lots of modules that have no communication. And you're following a distance learning course, surely you might want to talk to students or perhaps a teacher. So what we can then do is, by doing this kind of brain dump of teachers, we can say, okay, how do our students actually learn? So you're a little bit quiet, so I'm going to give you again an opportunity to talk to your neighbor. Imagine that you can choose one of 3 modules. And here you see the workload in those 3 different modules. And the yellow, orangey color is assimilative activities. The blue is assessment, and then all the others are smaller activities. So go talk to your neighbor and then tell me afterwards, which module would you like to study? Study module 1, module 2, or module 3? Go ahead. Okay. It's good to hear noise. This is very good. So who wants to study module number 1? Just raise your hand. Oh, there's only one. Would anyone to volunteer to say why? Yeah, go. Just shout. Yes, there is like an amazing peak, an amazing mountain that you have to climb, but then afterwards it's quite relatively easy going. Okay. I would be I'm a cyclist, I love mountains, but that workload of 20 hours in then one particular week could be quite daunting. What about who chose number 2? Okay, slightly more. So who would be willing to comment on why module 2? Yes, it's very well organized. It's a flat stage. It's always the same amount of work. And every time when there is an assessment, the other workload is basically being reduced. So this might be a really interesting module. Yes, there's also communication, and the communication is throughout the module. Thank you for that. Sorry? Yes, there's focus on experiential. So basically this teacher uses maybe all the range of learning design activities. Who chose module number 3? Hooray! Right, it seems a vast majority. Why is that? Why did you choose for module 3? Sorry? Yeah, it is more productive. There's lots of pink. What more? Okay. Yes. So it's just a title that attracted you. Okay, yeah, fine. I mean, no one wants to study business and law. I appreciate that. What else? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, there is a very big, for those who didn't hear, there's a very big assessment activity on 2 other modules, while in module number 3 there's a continuous assessment of skills. Yes, the lady over there?
Well, I am not going to choose this, and I put it really in question. How is it possible that communication does not exist in languages and education? I work with this area.
Yes, you hit as we say in Dutch, you hit the nail on the head. How in a language and communication introductory course, I'm not going to shame the teacher, but it was I think French or Spanish. How can there be no communication? So when we interviewed the teachers, they in a way thought that productive, like learning to speak a language, was in their sense communication. Of course, they did learn it in a way. Another argument could be is these are all first-year modules, but in the 3rd module there is hardly any workload in comparison to the 3rd. So is that good or is that bad? But what I think this shows is that even if you have 3 introductory modules, these modules seem completely different in terms of design. But the nice thing is we can then link that to what our students are actually doing. And more importantly, from an educational research perspective, we can see, okay, which design is actually best for which types of learners. So that's really exciting. So what you then can start to do is to think about big pedagogical questions. Is it better to design more traditional constructivist learning approach with lots of assimilative activities? Or is it perhaps better to design more productive designs, or is it perhaps better to design more social constructivist designs where students have to communicate and interact over time? And what you can then start to do is to link all this data together by seeing what are they doing in the virtual learning environment. Does this lead to better student satisfaction, and does this lead to better student retention? So let's have a look at the computer science module that we showed, but that we briefly discussed in the beginning. This is the computer science module. And you see at the same time a new red line, which I haven't showed you before. This red line is the average VLE activity in that particular week in terms of minutes that students spend on average. So is there a link between how teachers are designing courses and what our students are doing on average, based on what you see? I don't hear an overwhelming yes, but there seems to be potentially some. Let's take another module. Yes, apparently in this module, every time when there is an assessment, here we go. Every time when there is an assessment, there seems to be a lot of VLE engagement. If I take another module, there seems to be a link. And the nice thing, of course, is that with all these numbers, we can start to really unpack what's behind it, which element is driving engagement. And I'm not at all saying that engagement per se is good learning. I'm just saying, okay, on a macro level, we can start to link this data. So I probably should have had a health and safety warning here. These are 73 different modules at the OU, and these are modules built on so-called constructivist design principles, so lots of assimilative activities. And what you see here is that on average, most students spend around 100 minutes per week in the virtual learning environment. 100 minutes in a 20-hour course, is that a lot? I don't know. If you, for example, look at social constructivist courses, you see a different picture. You see that more and more engagement is happening. You see that there is more engagement on average, but you at the same time see a lot of variation happening. So what you can then do is to start to do all this modeling. And for the technical details, because some of you have said that learning analytics is a little bit intimidating, I'm not going to go through all the hardcore analytics the data analysis. I'm going to show you the bigger picture. If you want to know the hardcore analytics behind it, go and look at these papers. And I've uploaded also the slides on SlideShare, so feel free to find them after. So what we found was quite striking, is that teachers who design more traditional constructivist courses seem to be negatively related to VLE engagement on a week by week. So more traditional courses led to lower engagement, while more social constructivist courses led to higher engagement. But there didn't seem to be a relation. Oh, yes? Oh, sorry, VLE engagement is, yeah, sorry, this is virtual learning environment engagement. This is just the average time that students on average spend in a week. So that could be you just clicking 100 times to download a YouTube movie, or it could be making lots of equations all the time online. So this is a very aggregate score, and later on we will dig deeper into that. Yeah, so technically the difficulty, and there's an amazing paper by Vitromir, what's his last name again? Yeah, he basically, how you measure time is really complex, because if I click on a particular exercise and go and make a coffee, then the computer thinks that I spent a lot of time on that particular exercise. But of course, if you aggregate and aggregate this over thousands of students, you get a proxy of engagement on a module. So any further questions? So what we find quite interesting, there's no relation between the amount of time spent in the VLE and student satisfaction, and we also find no relation between VLE engagement and academic performance. But we do find something really interesting across 151 modules and 115,000 students, is that students love constructivist learning designs. Modules that were taught by constructivist learning design principles receive much higher, significantly higher student evaluation scores. While at the same time, courses that had social constructivist learning designs received significantly lower satisfaction scores, which is kind of, my heart bleeds when I hear this result. But what we found was that at the same time, courses that had more social constructivist engagement led eventually to better retention over time, and in particular when teachers included communication activities. So the best predictor for student retention was whether teachers included communication in their design. So the fundamental question that our Vice Chancellor asked, should we focus on student satisfaction, or should we focus on retention? Both. How do you do that? So there is really interesting, the way how our teachers are designing courses has a fundamental influence on what our students are actually doing. And some latest research shows that nearly 60 to 69% of what teachers design on a week-by-week basis seems to influence what our students are actually doing. So our teachers are really important, as we all know. So the next question is, can we then change teachers? Of course we can't, but at least we can try to show them a little bit of sense of direction of maybe if you slightly change the way how you design your courses, maybe we can actually lead to perhaps better retention. So what we did with 80 teachers, 80 courses, we gave no visualizations of their learning design while they were working in a workshop. And afterwards we gave 80 teams of teachers visualizations of their initial learning designs and also suggestions to perhaps slightly change. Guess what? What this shows is that just by visualizing the initial brains of teachers, the way how they design courses, we fundamentally, in a way, changed how they started to design courses. They significantly reduced the focus on assimilative, and they significantly increased activities towards more inquiry-based learning and communication. I should have explained this more clearly, but every 1% increase in communication seems to lead to a 0.5% increase in retention at our Open University. So by increasing communication with 5%, this could really have a very positive impact on retention, which is our biggest concern. So I think what this shows, by just visualizing the holy grail of learning analytics to teachers, we can actually help them to change a little bit. So coming back to your point, because we focus indeed only about aggregate VLE activity, this is a very aggregate measure, we of course can really start to also drill deeper into what students are actually doing. So this is thanks to Kwan Neugen, amazing PhD student. He looked at what so-called excellent students were doing in a course and what so-called failing students were doing in a course. And this is a nice heat map visualization of when they are clicking on particular activities. And if I show you what failing students do, if you flick between the two, you can quite nicely see, that there's a different intensity, but more importantly, excellent students seem to start earlier with particular materials. And then the next question is, but what are they then clicking on? And the next slide is again a health and safety warning. This looks really scary. I do apologize for this. So what we can then do is then zoom in terms of what are those students then actually doing. So this is Bayesian network modeling by the Knowledge Media Institute. So these are students. And what you see in these Bayesian networks is the kind of activities that these students are doing. So for example, on the left-hand side, a student clicked on a forum in a week, or clicked on a forum and looked at particular kind of structured content, or did nothing, or looked at other OU content. So by looking at the kind of activities that students are doing, we can start to map what are the best routes to roam. But more importantly, it also allows us to see if students are not clicking on particular learning activities, we can then use that to help our students. So I mentioned before that learning analytics is heavily context specific. So this module is nicely mapped in this particular learning analytics approach, but if you look at a different module, the mind map, the route to Rome, looks completely different. So I want to also warn you a little bit, if you think that there is the holy grail of learning analytics is just one algorithm, that probably won't be true. So what you can then do with these Bayesian network models is you can give dashboards to teachers. So in this dashboard, and this is now tested with 60,000 students at the Open University, with this dashboard, we can give teachers really fine-grained data of which students are doing really well based on their actual clicking. So not the average time spent, but based on the actual clicking, and also based on not clicking. And then teachers can zoom in to see, okay, what is that student actually doing? And the latest feature that we will introduce is we can also then give them personalized recommendations of what additional activities students can do. So this is amazing work by Thea Rodotu. She basically started to look at, okay, does giving this data to teachers, does this actually help teachers? So we worked with 240 teachers in 10 modules, and 600 teachers didn't want to work with us. They didn't seem to like analytics, which I respect. So we were basically wondering, does giving learning analytics data to teachers across those 10 modules actually make an impact? And the really interesting findings are that in 3 modules, it had a very positive effect on student retention. On 4 modules, nothing happened. And on 3, we had a very negative effect. So it was like, how can that be? That doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. So what Thea and her group then started to do is to look at, okay, what were teachers actually doing? So this is a heat map again of engagement of teachers in those 10 modules. What do you see in that heat map? How are teachers using this particular analytics? Do you see anything? Sorry? Some do. Our amazing computer course here. Many teachers seem to actively, on a week-by-week case, look at this amazing data. But indeed, there are some modules, not to be shamed, let's anonymously call them social science. Only after 14 weeks that half of the teachers look at analytics data, and then, well, I mean, there are lots of blanks. So in a way, what it shows, in a way, which is quite nice, if you put out learning analytics in the wild, some modules or some teachers really actively use it, but at the same time, many don't seem to really use it. So then the question is, does it matter? So what Thea then did was to link student characteristics with teacher characteristics, what they were doing, and they linked it with learning design. And the paper is hopefully going to be accepted soon. So it's under submission. And what we found quite strikingly, that the best predictors for passing, not surprisingly, were previous scores of students. So students who did well previously also do well again. But what is even more surprising is that whether or not teachers use the OU Analyze, the analytics engine, and the intensity of use significantly predicted as the second best predictor pass rate. So by giving teachers analytics data, we can actually help them to support students. So to conclude the first part of the keynote is that what we can see is that the way how learning analytics is potentially empowering teachers is that learning analytics can really enhance and facilitate the teaching practice. And I admit this is in a distance learning context, but at the same time there's a very strong variation in terms of what teachers are actually doing, both in the way how they design courses, but also how they are using learning analytics. So this is really powerful stuff, but at the same time we have tremendous work to be done. How can we convince our teachers that actually learning analytics could be really useful for our students? Is everyone still with me? Yeah, are we still good? Okay. So let's move to the... oh yes, there's a question.
I was wondering, you showed that those very active teachers that higher scores, but what about if they are simply very active teachers and otherwise simply looking at the analytics anyway? So there's no kind of proof there yet.
Totally agree. You should talk to our vice chancellor, because originally Thea and I wanted to do hardcore randomized control trials. But yeah, many people in our organization were a little bit concerned about this, because it could be an artifact that very active teachers who are anyway looking at this could, it's just a reflection, but at the same time it's quite surprising, given that these teachers are at a distance, that this has such a big effect on our students. And all the other characteristics of the teachers didn't seem to play a role. So we have to further unpack this. And that's hopefully what I think we're going to do that next year with randomized control trials. So hopefully maybe we can present that next year. Any other questions?
Yeah, so where did the negative effects in 3 of the courses come from?
Yeah, so I shouldn't shame and name those teachers, but primarily in courses where analytics was not used, we found that there seemed to be a negative effect, and partly this again could be due to the kind of self-selection of teachers, and partly it could also be that the self-selected teachers initially said, oh yeah, sorry mate, you're never going to make it, and maybe they were more active in persuading students to switch to a different course. But I mean, that is a difficulty, of course, in quasi-experimental or this kind of in-the-field research. Thank you. Yeah, there's another question over there. Yes.
Blurring into averaging it all out, some different paths learners need to go through.
Yeah, I think that. Thank you for raising that point. I don't know if everyone heard this. There are many routes to Rome, and I basically seem to suggest that there's only one route to Rome. There is this nice visualization. There are some students who do nothing in week 1, nothing in week 2, nothing in week 3, etc., and still pass the course. There are many students who do completely wild different things and still pass that next assessment. So we're not claiming that there's only one route. What we're trying to do is give students more visualization of, okay, which potential routes might fit you. So sorry if I didn't make that very clear. Any other questions before we go, Krina? Yeah. Yeah. I think this is a very difficult question about engagement. What is clicking? Is clicking in a discussion forum and contributing a post or a really considerate thought, is that the same as just watching a particular piece of structured content? And what you also see is in different visualizations is that, that in different modules, certain activities are really important and others are not. So I think we're on that journey together, hopefully, and that's why we need educational research to make sense. If we see certain paths are really important, for example, this arrow of resource seems to be really important in getting to that root of Rome. What is that resource? What is happening in that particular week? So I'm trying to keep my flow. So what about students? How can we empower students, and how can we as educational researchers actually use learning analytics? And I'm going to be slightly provocative here, is how do students make sense of the complex things around them on the internet? And how do they search to make sense of that problem? So there's a nice guy who apparently looked at the eclipse and he claimed that global warming doesn't exist. So how do students start to make sense of that global warming? And how do students make sense? How do they search the internet? And there's a widely established instrument which is called the Internet-Specific Epistemic Questionnaire, which seems to indicate that if students complete this questionnaire, then it can quite nicely predict what students are doing. And this has been cited in many different studies, primarily using self-report instruments. So we thought, okay, this is an interesting way of thinking about how students search. So let's test that with real data and to see how well self-report actually links to what students are doing. So work by Simon Knight and Derek Templar, we basically started to focus on red yeast rice. Who has heard of red yeast rice? Okay, 2-3 people. Apparently, red yeast rice has some potential positive effects for health, but at the same time there are some potential negative effects for health. But the debate is still out there. So we ask students to work in pairs and to eventually come up with a recommendation to the government. Is red yeast rice something positive for society or not? And they were allowed to search for 1 hour in a lab. And we were basically monitoring everything they were doing. So the key terms they were using, the sites they visited, but also more importantly, the sites that they didn't visit. And that would allow us to see, okay, what are students actually doing and how do they make sense of a complex thing like this particular red yeast problem. And what you find here, and I do apologize for the small print, is the 20 most used websites by students. And if you see all the way in the right-hand side, the vast majority of these websites are, well, let's call it layman's advice. Only on website 16, which were used by 22% of the students, that they actually go to some kind of government website. Google Scholar was only used 14 times. So apparently students, when they're trying to make sense of these complex problems, they don't necessarily seem to look at good sources, which is interesting. But coming back to the big question, does educational theory, in this case the Isaac question, actually predict what students are doing? Well, we can test this. So what we looked at is the unique pages that students viewed, the unique pages actually used, so they might click on many pages but only extract certain key elements of that page, the unique search queries they used, the amount of messages they posted to each other by working together in a diet. And what we find is there's not a single correlation between what they were actually doing and their self-reported internet searching skills. So I'm not saying this is a bad instrument, but what it allows us as educational researchers to do is, if we have an educational theory, learning analytics, this fine-grained analysis would allow you to test whether or not that theory works in practice. So this is quite exciting, I think. Another thing which is really exciting is then to use, and this is just a normal university context, so this is not distance learning, is to look at, okay, how are students in a normal university making sense of how they're learning and how do they actually work through their first year's course. So what we tried with my partner in crime for many years, the Exemplar, is we looked at, okay, how are students profiles, their kind of characteristics and their particular dispositions, their motivations, their emotions, their learning approaches. How does this influence how they're working on particular mathematics exercises, because this was a course in mathematics, and how does this link to how well they're actually performing? So coming back also to your, sorry, I'm not pinpointing it, but coming back on VLE engagement, if you only look at clicking behavior in a VLE, like for example Blackboard, you can then see, okay, does clicking behavior in VLE actually predict how students are performing over time? So the first graph is this, where Dirk linked over 40 different characteristics of clicking behavior in Blackboard and whether or not students eventually passed the module over a 7-week period. So is clicking behavior in Blackboard, is that a good predictor for performance? It's quite low, it's 0.1 in week 0. And it goes up ever so slightly, but it's still, at the end of the course, we're not very accurate in terms of whether a student is going to pass or not. If we then look at what really matters in learning, namely the activities that they're expected to do, in this case, working on mathematics and statistical problems, and looking at the log files of what they are doing in those statistics and mathematical programs, you see that slowly the accuracy of prediction starts to increase. And once we, for example, include assessments, for example, a pre-test, a test after 3 weeks, 5 weeks, and 7 weeks, we become increasingly accurate in terms of whether or not a student is going to pass, but more importantly, when should we start to intervene. So what we try to do with this piece of work is we had over 120 different variables to predict which students are likely to pass a course, including emotions, including motivation. And what we found was that if you have all this data available at the beginning, we are quite accurate already in the beginning with all that data in terms of who is probably going to do well and who is not going to do well. But apparently in week 3, the predictions go up quite tremendously. So we're more comfortable in terms of where to intervene. So for example, you could say, well, let's intervene in week 7 because we are really certain who's going to pass that mathematics course. But of course, that's too late to make an impact. Or you could say, okay, let's intervene in week 0. But in week 0, you still have lots of variation, which might make it tricky. So if you then look at week 3, for example, you see this amazing scatter plot. We, for example, see that some students we predicted to score 3 out of 5, but only scored 1 out of 4, sorry. So the next question is, if we can see in week 3 which students we potentially could target. And I think we're getting now to the crux of learning analytics. This looks really nice in theory, but these dots are real people. And these dots who are real people, how do you know that in terms of personalization, that's the kind of intervention they want? So in follow-up research with Dirk, we looked at the kind of dispositions, the characteristics that these different groups of students had. So we, for example, did cluster analysis to identify what kind of activities these students actually do and what are their characteristics in terms of motivation and emotion. So for example, if we focus on one group of students, these are cluster 4 students. In general, they are quite low e-learners in terms of their mastery. They're not really engaged in e-learning. And they do reasonably well on the mathematics exam. But if you look at their dispositions, they're more likely to procrastinate, to delay. They're more likely to be bored. And they're more likely to have lower anxiety. So if if you would be that cluster 4 student, and I would say, hey, mate, hurry up, what would you say? You're doing it exactly right. Okay. Well, if you, for example, look at cluster 1 students, these are completely different kettle of fish. These are cluster 1 students who are continuously active in the environment, continuously engaged in the mathematics exercise, but at the same time, they have stronger anxieties, and they're a very good planner. So if suddenly that student is identified at risk, and I'm saying to you again, hey, mate, you have to really hurry up, because if you don't, you might be left behind. That same message to 2 completely different students might come across completely in a different way. So what would you say if you would be this cluster 1 student? It is boring. Don't worry. yeah, maybe you're cluster 4 student. So I guess what I think what it highlights the complexities is that if you come back to this little picture, these dots are real students, and these real students have all different kinds of motivations, emotions, elements. So a message that might work very well for one type of student might completely upset another, and vice versa. So what I'm trying to bring forward, and this is where I'm going to end, is that I think we're slowly getting to a stage where we can give teachers really amazing keys to learning. That metaphor of the drunk, because we can really start to see which learning designs leads to the best learning. But at the same time, I think what is missing at this point in learning analytics research is, okay, how do we provide an eclipse class to students, knowing that each student is slightly different? So how do we start to close that holy grail model from teachers to students? And I think this is the next challenge, and I'm hoping that you will join us on this journey. And this joining of the journey is hopefully going to inspire you. And if it doesn't inspire you, at least with learning analytics, we can properly test educational theories, which is really amazing. So you don't have to start from scratch, because there is a free handbook which just came available a couple of months ago, where some really good practical case studies and applications of learning analytics are being made available. So you can just download it and see the latest research of learning analytics. And if you're brave enough, you can join us in Sydney. Sorry, this is a shameless plug. The deadline for learning analytics papers is the 2nd of October, so we're rounding that up. What I think I've hoped to try to show you today is that the way how teachers design courses, but more importantly, what teachers are actually doing, this strongly influences our students' engagement, our satisfaction and performance. And by just visualizing this to teachers, we can make a real difference. So what I hope you will do is when you go back to your institution is, okay, how can we use all that data that you're gathering to actually empower your teachers? And secondly, I think what I hopefully try to convince you today is that these learning analytics approaches can actually help us as early researchers to answer big and small theoretical questions, which can really help us to push the field forwards. And I think the biggest challenge that is still unanswered is how can we then actually give all this data to students in a sensible manner. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to your questions. I promised my colleagues not to include any cycling pictures. So hereby my mates when we won the World Championship. I do apologize for this. So yeah, there's maybe if you can bring a mic, yeah?
I've got a quite practical question. How did you collect the disposition scores?
Yes, that's a very good question. In the current way, how we're collecting data is literally by psychometric questionnaires. And if you want to know more, the guy who did that is sitting over there, Dirk. So as part of getting students ready to study, they basically fill in loads of psychometric questionnaires, and then the students have to analyze their own data and data from others, so they get a kind of sense of data, but more importantly, they get feedback on their own learning dispositions. At the same time, one of my amazing PhD students is actually looking at, can we actually mine data, for example, the way how we write, can it actually give away emotions, for example, or the way how you look in a particular camera. Yesterday there was a very good session by Sanna Järvelä and Roger Azevedo that actually shows that if you look in front of your camera, you can actually really already see lots of emotions. So I think that beyond self-report, I think there are many other opportunities to start to measure learning dispositions. So that's a long-winded question, answer to the question. It's just surveys, sorry. Any other questions? All the way in the back.
Thank you for a very inspiring presentation. I have always wondered about the concept learning analytics. For instance, the examples that you showed, you have analyzed actions and activities, maybe student products. Mm-hmm. Perhaps in the future we can put a wire in the brain and analyze learning, probably not even then. Have there been any discussion about using some other concept than learning analytics?
Yeah, that's a very good question, because in a way the metaphor of this kind of brain scan that we make of teachers, or the brain scan that we're trying to do of students, it's still a proxy of what our teachers are thinking or what our students are actually doing. So even that clicking behavior or even that writing, the way how students write, there could be hundreds of complex processes in their head that might influence what they're doing. So I think one of the real great opportunities of learning analytics is that you can test some of these elements in a lab. So if you have some wild ideas about how students are learning, in a lab you can do really nice randomized control trials. But at the same time, I think what this kind of research on a big level shows, that even in the big wild world, we can start to unpack some of those elements. And it is really surprising, for example, what I showed previously, that 69% of what students are doing on a week-by-week basis at the Open University seems to be predicted by how our teachers are working and designing courses. So yes, there is then still some variance which is not explained, but I think that shows some real great potential. And I'm not proclaiming that we should become the Matrix, where we just plug a cable in our head. That would be really petrifying. And what I think within the learning analytics community, more and more of these kind of fine-grained measures, using eye tracking, using gaze, we can really start to unpack the fine-grained kind of analytics of our students. So thank you for that question. Yeah, there is a question over here. Yes. Oh, there's a question over here. Sorry. Here all the way in the front, sorry. Or you can just shout, yeah? Yeah.
Thank you for your presentation. I think we are developing as a society, since I think it's very clear that we are not able, any of us working in any of areas, to solve the problem of learning. But I think your presentation shows very nicely that we have to learn to bridge our methods and work in a very systematic, more systematic way. Like we have been working, as we had yesterday a couple of symposia, trying to get new modalities of data or evidence about student learning processes, something what was it Minna who pointed out. But we are totally helpless with that data. And that's the why we are not yet there, we are not able to make that bridge very strong yet, but hopefully we are able to struggle, because we feel quite empty without making this data visible for us and for learners. And I claim that learning analytics is quite empty because it's not targeting to the real learning complex process data, but good progress still. Thank you.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more in that respect, in the sense that also when I showed my second slide with the amazing people, I could not do this by myself. I think we're making tremendous progress within the Open University, but at the same time we have many big questions left, and all this data is really interesting, but we need more and more computer scientists and data scientists who can make sense of the data. But at the same time we need us, as educational researchers, psychologists, learning scientists, to really start to make sense of the data. When I sometimes have conversations with our amazing data mining people, they say, hey, there's the strongest correlation between performance and something else is their last assessment score. And you're like, yeah, what is interesting about that? So it's really about the underlying mechanism. And I really would like to also join your network, because I think the more we can work together as integrated researchers, the better it is. I'm aware that we're asking a lot of questions on this side, and I want to be inclusive. There's a gentleman all the way at the back.
This might seem random, but I've always been a fan of the Open University, and I did a course with the Open University 30 years ago, which was called Distance Learning, and you received a big box of books and stuff and information, and people always made jokes about it because there were television programmes and the men presenting always used to have beards, long hair and more flares, you know, so it became a bit of a national joke. But are people in general here aware of the principles and practices of the University? Because I think it's a fairly unique organisation in terms of higher education, you know. Perhaps you explained that before I came in, I don't know. But I think that's an interesting question or interesting thing to explain. I don't know, maybe not.
Yeah, so I unfortunately don't have a beard. Yeah, but the Open University is quite unique there in the sense that the Open University is open to all. So we don't have any entry criteria, so we accept any kind of student. But of course, given the wide diversity of our students, I guess that's why learning analytics is an important element. We can then help both teachers and students to see if there are certain groups of students who are already really struggling. We should grab them at an earlier stage. And at the same time, if I'm open and honest, and I know I'm being recorded, we haven't got the model right yet, because we're making big losses and we are struggling to keep our students. So I think what we're trying to move towards is, okay, how can we, and this comes back to Sanna's point, is how can we use learning analytics that is relevant to our students, that keeps them motivated to continue at such a difficult institution or a difficult context of distance learning. So thank you for that question. Any other comments? Yes?
Yeah, well, thank you very much. I think there's lots of potential in what you're doing. Still some points of criticism if you're profiling learners and you see the good ones and the bad ones and see what they're doing respectively. You don't really know why they are doing what they're doing, and you cannot turn that into advice for teachers to or students to model the good student activities, because first of all, you don't know why they are struggling. Might be because they're stupid, might be because they're under pressure of other sorts. And also you don't know if the activities that the, well, problematic students are showing, whether that is compensating for their struggle or for their problems or not. So it's hard to derive a clear notion of why that is happening, and there's maybe a bit more theoretical approaches would be helping here. And of course there's an ethical dimension of profiling learners, because now we know who are the bad ones, and we know that they're lazy because we see them. We see how lazy they are and what they're doing or not doing. That's you know, not really. There's a potential of that not really advancing the situation overall, right?
I totally agree, and I think that's also a main distinction to split hairs between, I think, learning analytics and educational data mining. In learning analytics, we think that there still needs to be a human element. So when, for example, our analytics shows that the second student who went from 66 to 60, and suddenly our system predicts that student is at risk. There could be hundreds of reasons why that student is potentially at risk. It might be that he or she went on holiday, or it might be that there's a bereavement in the family, or maybe he went to the World Transplant Games and thus didn't log in for 2 weeks. So what this learning analytics does allow our teachers to do is to have the kind of conversation. Hey, Armin, I noticed you haven't logged in for 2 weeks. Are you all right? And quite interestingly, when we were coming to your ethics questions, we interviewed 100 students, and 50 students were basically like, I don't want to be profiled. I don't want to be profiled because I'm green, blue, black, whatever. Just because our analytics system says that I'm red, that doesn't mean that I am red. While the other 50 students were saying, yeah, I was really surprised. I went on holiday for 2 weeks. And I was really behind, but no one called me. So I think there is a big challenge of, okay, how do we use this data in an ethical way, but also in a way that is inclusive for our students, and knowing that some of our students are from a disadvantaged background. We can't just say, oh, you know, for example, the one here, this one didn't submit in the first assessment, but suddenly did really well on the second assessment. I mean, I would be really curious as a teacher, what's happening there? Let's have that conversation. So I think there's a lot of work to be done, both on a kind of practical element, but more importantly also from a theoretical point. What is the best way to support our students in this difficult and complex environment? So I hope that answered your question. Are there any further questions? Yeah, so a couple of more, yes.
You think there's some difficulty in describing this as lazy? The word lazy for me doesn't really provide much information about the motivation.
Sorry, could you just put a mic, because I couldn't hear that, sorry.
What's your reaction to the use of the word lazy to describe a student's behaviour? How do you feel about that? For me, it doesn't really provide much information as to the student's motivation, beliefs, underlying reasons for perhaps not wishing to do something, although it's a term that's frequently used,
yeah.
I know, in institutions. What's your attitude towards the use of that word, that discourse, you know?
Yeah, I think that is a very valid question. I think this links really, I think, to the core of learning analytics. We're all making assumptions about what good students are supposed to do. So I think the next big frontier in terms of learning analytics that links back to the last point is, if a student just wants to scrape by and then eventually pass something, or just read materials because he's interested in it, but that's the only thing he wants to do, perfectly fine. Our learning analytics approach, our engines should start to cater for that. It's quite interesting. At the Open University, we have approximately 4 to 5% of students who are prisoners, and they are not allowed to use computers. So our analytics will say, okay, didn't do anything, didn't do anything, didn't do anything, didn't do anything. But if you wouldn't know that they are prisoners, we would send out hundreds of emails which won't be actually received by them. So I think what I'm trying to get at is big data doesn't mean that we should get rid of people, but you need people to start to make sense of this. So it is a challenging prospect, and I think we have to come to terms with that. Yeah, there's a lady in the middle with a blue shirt.
Thank you. Just on the back of that, it seems to me that there's a lot of conversation here about forming categories of various kinds. Mm-hmm. And there's a work that you do in terms of looking at the data that comes out, there's the choices that you make around algorithms, all that kind of gear. And I was just wondering, have you given much thought to how we ensure that those processes are adaptive, flexible, inclusive, open, etc.?
Thank you for asking that question. This allows me to give another plug to Sharon Slade's work. So when we designed the ethics for learning analytics policy, we agreed that we would revisit that ethics policy on a year-by-year basis. Every year there's a big meeting of a couple of people like me with Sharon Slade, and we look at, okay, the way how we've defined certain algorithms and the way how we've approached particular labeling, is that appropriate, and there's that student representation there as well. But I think by being open about what we do, we at least try to be transparent, but we might at the same time miss a couple of tricks. So I think by being open that by being open, when our students register to our courses, we basically specifically state, we request for your consent to use that data because we want to improve your service. And unfortunately, at this moment in time, students always have to, click a tick box. Yes, I agree that you're using that data. But at the same time, we have to then be open. What are we doing with that? So I think it's about having that debate with students and by continuously refining that. But there then lies a fundamental problem, because how many of us would be able to build this stuff? How many people are able to understand this stuff? So there's a tremendous translation that is needed. And I think the only way how to solve it is by having an open, inclusive discussion. So thank you for that question.
I was wondering if this learning analytics is more suitable for helping improving the teaching of certain subjects. But as you show that the teachers from the social science are more reluctant to use learning analytics, is it possible that the learning analytics, for example, it can show that, okay, all those students have submitted their essay, but the quality of the essay can differ a lot.
Yeah.
One student can submit the essay that they wrote in 2 hours, and another student use 1 week. Well, we may be very difficult to analyze that through learning analytics. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I mean, disciplines definitely matter, and the way how we can see that disciplines matter is the way how then teachers design courses. But at the same time, there are certain programs where even in the kind of softer sciences, there's a quite good uptake of learning analytics, and that's about empowering that group of teachers that are responsible for at the Open University we call assistant teachers, associate lecturers. So I think in a way we have a big job to do to move away from disciplines and those boundaries, because yes, of course, in computer science, these computer teachers like this kind of stuff. But how can we also ensure that in the social science that, we can actually convince teachers that using analytics is useful? And I think by doing good research on this, we can then go back, if you use analytics, this potentially could help your students. So thank you for that. Yeah, there's a question over here. And by the way, feel free to tweet me questions, which I will, of course, answer later on if you don't want to raise it in public.
Okay, thank you very much for your talk. you've shown that learning analytics is a very valuable tool in open university courses where much of the learning happens online. So what about traditional universities where most of the learning does not happen online? Do we have to make students click in order to use it?
That's a very good point. If I can make a plug to some of the work of one of my amazing postdocs, Katarina Rogaten, we've also now collected lots of data at normal universities. And there again, the way how teachers are designing courses, the way how they're assessing what they're actually doing, seems to be quite nicely related with what students are doing. So yes, the richness of the quality of data might not be as good as, for example, a distance learning university, but at the same time, increasingly, lots of students at a normal university are using a virtual learning environment, are using their phones, are learning outside the library. So increasingly, I think the 6 trends that I've identified also apply to universities and apply to primary schools and apply to secondary schools and adult education. In that sense, I think it will be interesting as normal universities to also think about this. And the last 2 cases that I showed with these students are actually at a normal university. Okay, yeah. 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 Yeah, I agree. Yeah. I couldn't agree with you more, and I think this is quite nicely illustrated by this slide, that if you just purely look at how students are clicking in the local virtual learning environment, the first picture on the left, it doesn't seem to really matter in terms of the predictions, but if you focus on real learning, basically the kind of activities that students had to do in this case, solving mathematical problems, that seemed to be very good related with what students were actually doing. So I think what the crux is, as us as teachers, is we have to help learning analytics researchers to identify, okay, what are the core learning activities? And I'm not saying we should always measure every learning activity, but there are some really good proxies beyond clicking data that could help us. Yeah, so students were expected to work through this complex mathematical exercises, so we both measured the kind of mastery of solving these mathematical exercises, but also the time spent and the number of clicks. But the best proxy, in a way, was, of course, the mastery that students develop on a week-by-week basis. So I want to, if you learn one thing from this keynote, it's not just about clicking, it's what students actually do. I think that's the holy grail that we're looking for. Thank you for that question. I'm also aware of time, so 5 minutes, good.
Thank you very much for your very provocative presentation. And I have 2 questions. The first question is towards the audience. I'm wondering, am I the only one who feels really provoked? Who else feels really provoked?
Yeah, we can do a poll. Only one.
Thank you. Anybody who feels a bit angry? No one? Wow, because you're contradictory to everything I learned at university. The first thing when I entered university was there is no holy grail to education. And I do believe that this is true. So my second question towards you is, would you bet with me on finding the holy grail to education, and how much would you bet?
Ooh. Oh. Normally with my colleagues I always bet in terms of nice whiskey bottles. So maybe after the session we can debate on which vintage year we need for whiskey bottle. I mean, that's why I like the metaphor of Holy Grail. The Holy Grail was never found, right? So I think what it shows, I was provocative by purpose because I think we can use some of the principles of learning analytics, but at the same time we really have to be firm on our feet in terms of educational theory and help us to really understand all this complex data. So I hope that no one is leaving this room angry, but I hope that many of you will think, oh, actually, this might be cool, and there might be some computer scientists in my department or somewhere on campus that actually can do this kind of stuff. So let's work together in an interdisciplinary manner. And let's have a debate afterwards about which bottle of whiskey. Good. Yeah, there's...
Yes, thank you. But could you then elaborate a little bit more? Because you said that the Open University has a kind of ethical agenda for possibly providing or working against that the data that is analyzed by learning analytics is in a kind of way misused, because you were mentioning earlier there are a lot of field players in the field using learning analytics, and as we put more research on it, and we would think that it is a good tool and a powerful tool for teachers, there will come more profit-oriented players in the field and making suggestions how to use learning analytics. But we as researchers, we might think that is a good idea to put some research on it, but we also do not work profit-oriented. But I think there will be a lot of companies working profit-oriented and that take these informations that coming from learning analytics, like the profiles of specific students, and just use them for profit making.
I mean, this links to the fifth trend that I alluded to in terms of the light. Big companies are stepping into this place. So the publisher Pearson, I don't think is a sponsor for EARLI, so we can basically say how disgraceful. They're setting up a university, basically an online university, using all the analytics that they have from all the people downloading all their materials, and they are using personalized and flexible advice based on that clicking data. So the question is, if big commercial companies like Pearson or Newton, for example, if they're using all this data, does that give them a competitive advantage? And should we, because other commercial organizations are stepping into the space of education, should we do the same, or should we not do that? And I think these are real big ethical and economic and political debates that I think we should have. And I'm pretty sure, I haven't studied at the University of Pearson, but I'm not entirely sure that they will raise awareness on the first day that you study, hey, by the way, we're collecting all your data, and actually this will help to further improve our products. So I think there's a really big dilemma here. And I think we should be part of that discussions, rather than seeing, okay, analytics is somewhere that happens outside of EARLI and we don't have to worry per se about this. Yeah? Yeah?
Has to be a quick one then. Bart, thank you very much for a great presentation. I am not angry, but I agree with a lot of what you say. But actually, I have a question, because what you present is a lot of naturalistic settings. So you create, you analyze the data from the courses that you have. And at the same time, I heard you say that you would like to have a randomized control trial. And in some ways, that might contradict the ideas of big data, because we think we don't actually need any design anymore, because we can actually derive from the relations. And I'd like to hear your take on where experiments and randomized control trials can be used in settings like this.
So one of the big commercial competitors, Kaplan University, is using A/B testing nearly continuously on their introductory courses. So if they have a button on the left or a button on the right, and they can see, okay, if having a button on the left or a button on the right is better. So they're continuously doing it. At the Open University, I've been fighting for 4 years to do this kind of stuff. And unfortunately, this is not yet really happening. But at the same time, there are some really good drivers of change happening at this moment in time. And Professor Alison Littlejohn is leading some of those changes. So maybe go and talk to Alison to encourage us to do more randomized control trials. Because eventually, I mean, I always feel, my classical joke when I make a keynote is, I will be sued in 5 years' time by our students, because we can see which students are at risk and which students are failing, but we're not necessarily acting upon that. And I think we should really be much more innovative in terms of pushing those kind of innovative research methods to really help our students and to really identify what makes us being able to help those students. So thank you for pushing that on the agenda.
Please join me in thanking Dr. Rienties for a very thought-provoking and very interactive presentation today. Thank you so much.